a golden fork at a wedding banquet. That is all it took. In the year 1004, a Byzantine princess named Maria Argyropoulina sailed into Venice to marry the son of the Doge. She brought small golden forks to her own wedding feast and used them in front of the Venetian court. The clergy in attendance were scandalized. Eating with artificial tines, they argued, was an insult to God's design. He had already given man natural forks. Her own fingers would do. 2 years later, Maria was dead. Plague took her, her husband, and their infant son. The chroniclers called it divine punishment. The popular version of this story says the church banned the fork for 400 years. The real version is stranger and more uncomfortable. The fork was not rejected because it was useless. It was rejected because it was presumptuous. An object that suggested nature's design was not good enough. And that verdict did not need to be official to last 6 centuries. If you have ever picked up a fork at dinner, you have already guessed how this story ends, but almost no one knows how it actually began. The marriage was a political arrangement between 2 empires. Maria was the niece of Byzantine Emperor Basil II, according to the medieval chronicler Andrea Dandolo, and the sister of the man who would become Emperor Romanos III. Her husband was Giovanni Orseolo, son of Doge Pietro II Orseolo. The wedding was meant to cement a Venetian-Byzantine alliance. It was statecraft, with a banquet attached. Maria arrived carrying the table customs of the Byzantine court. The Byzantine Empire considered itself the heir to Roman refinement, and its dining customs reflected that. Maria was, by any measure, the most important bride Venice had hosted in years. In elite Byzantine households, small 2-pronged forks had been in use since at least the 7th century. They were not experimental, they were not exotic. To Maria, lifting a golden fork at dinner was as ordinary as reaching for a cup. Byzantine emperors dined on silver plates with matched utensils. The fork in that world was a sign of cultivation, not vanity. Maria was not showing off. She was being herself. In Venice, no one used them. Diners ate with their hands, with knives, with spoons. A small knife handled the cutting. The fingers did the rest. That was dinner. When Maria speared her food with a golden fork in full view of the Venetian table, the gesture registered as something between foreign and obscene. The clergy present saw vanity. Worse, they saw a theological problem. God had designed the human hand with 5 precise tools. To replace one with metal was to suggest his craftsmanship had fallen short. Maria's golden forks were the wrong object, in the wrong city, held by the wrong woman. The person who turned Maria's wedding into a moral lesson for the ages was not at the wedding. He was an Italian Benedictine monk named Peter Damian, born around 1007, about a year after Maria died, and living far to the south in central Italy. Half a century after the banquet, Damian wrote a letter. It survives as letter 91 in his collected correspondence, with some variation in numbering across editions. In it, he described the fork as a golden instrument with 2 prongs, and framed Maria's use of it as effeminate vanity, the kind of refined luxury that softened the soul and invited God's wrath. Damian had a broader project. He was a fierce reformer of clerical morals, obsessed with rooting out luxury and sexual permissiveness in the church. Maria's fork was useful evidence for him. He described her early death by plague, her husband's death, the death of their infant son, as the sword of divine justice for her vanity. The interpretation was not an objective report. It was moral argument dressed as history. But it was the only history anyone wrote. No Venetian chronicler of the period mentions the fork incident at all. Not John the Deacon in his Chronicle of Venice, not Andrea Dandolo later. Damian's single letter became the entire record, and it became more than a letter. Over the following centuries, it became European common sense. Here is the part the popular story misses. No church council, no papal bull, no canon law ever formally banned the fork. Damien's personal invective, one monk's disgust, simply hardened into cultural consensus. The mechanism was monastic suspicion of luxury. Medieval religious culture broadly distrusted refinement, soft living, delicate food, ornate utensils. Forks fell into that category. They were the implement of the effeminate, the decadent, the over-civilized. To use one at table was to advertise that you had too much time, too much money, and too little piety. This is how a moral preference becomes an institutional reality without ever passing through an institution. No one wrote it down as law. No priest at the altar proclaimed it forbidden. It simply became the thing a serious person did not do. And so, for centuries, the fork sat in a strange exile. In Byzantine palaces, it remained ordinary. In the Islamic world, similar utensils appeared in elite dining. But in Latin Christendom, the territory of the church Damien served, the personal table fork was almost invisible, not banned, just unspeakably gauche. Italian aristocrats began quietly using forks across the 14th and 15th centuries, but the objects remained rare and contested. They were the kind of thing one noticed at a banquet, and not always kindly. The utensil Maria had used without thinking in 1004 was, in 1400, still a marker of moral danger. The reversal, when it came, had nothing to do with theology. Italian merchants and travelers had been carrying forks northward for decades. Catherine de' Medici is popularly credited with making the fork fashionable at the French court, though forks were already filtering into French aristocratic life through Italian merchants and travelers. The story usually begins in 1533, when a 14-year-old Italian princess named Caterina de' Medici crossed the Alps to marry the future King Henry II of France. She brought Florentine cooks, Italian table customs, and forks. The French court, accustomed to eating with fingers and knives, watched an Italian queen eat politely with a small metal implement, and they copied her. This was not a religious reform. It was fashion, aristocratic prestige signaling. Catherine did not argue that forks were godly. She used them, and the most powerful people in France wanted to behave like her. The shift rippled outward. By the late 16th century, forks had become standard in French aristocratic dining, then in the Dutch and German courts. The utensil crossed borders the way couture crosses borders, not by argument, but by imitation. In England, the trajectory was rougher. Queen Elizabeth IV was famously indifferent to the fork, reportedly continuing to eat in the older English style. But in 1611, an English writer named Thomas Coryat published a travel book called Coryat's Crudities. In it, he described Italian dining customs and praised the fork in print. He was mocked for years, but he kept championing the utensil in his writing. The idea spread. By the 1630s, the English court under Charles I had begun to adopt the fork, partly under the French influence of his queen, Henrietta Maria. More than 600 years after Maria Argyropoulina lifted a golden fork at her Venetian wedding, an English monarch was finally saying what she had taken for granted. The final twist is the most banal. The four-tined fork, the standard table fork we recognize today, was not invented in any royal court. In the late 18th century, probably in Naples, the four-tined fork was developed for a very specific job: eating pasta. Long strands of spaghetti slide off a two-pronged fork. Neapolitan diners solved the problem by adding two more tines. The new design caught on quickly because it solved a problem people actually had, not a moral problem anyone was still arguing about. The four-tined fork was practical, cheap to produce, and effective. It spread for the simplest reason in the history of design: it worked. The four-tined fork spread from Naples across Europe over the following decades, replacing the older two-tined model almost everywhere. Not because theology had softened, not because the church had reversed itself, because pasta had won. The utensil Maria Argyropoulina was condemned for using had become, half a millennium later, an engineering solution to a culinary problem she had never encountered. The fork that finally took over European tables was not the aristocratic implement of Byzantium. It was a Neapolitan pasta tool. The history of the fork is not, in the end, a story about the church. It is a story about how one monk's personal disgust, never codified into law, still shaped what people reached for at dinner, until aristocratic fashion, and eventually pasta, quietly overruled him. Maria Argyropoulina died in Venice in 1006 or 1007. She was somewhere around 20 years old. She left behind an infant son who died with her. The only chronicler who remembered her did so to condemn her. She never lived to see a single one of those forks accepted at a Western table. For more than 600 years, every European who reached for a fork at dinner was, in some quiet way, defying her ghost. The church never formally banned the fork. It did not have to. One monk's letter, one woman's death, one viral moral lesson. That was enough. The verdict held until fashion, not theology, reversed it. And the fork that finally won was not the aristocratic implement of Byzantium. It was a Neapolitan pasta tool. The object that suggested nature's design was not good enough was right all along. It just had to wait for the world to notice. What surprised you most about this story? Was it that the church never actually banned the fork, or that the modern fork was invented for pasta? Tell us in the comments. And if you enjoy uncovering the real origins behind familiar things, leave a like and subscribe to The Origin